Hello, my name is Ralph Brockhaus. I would like to welcome you to the Introduction to Swift class at UCI. So we're working on the next module, which is getting started with XCode development. So the agenda for the course today is getting started with XCode, to download the XCode environment, to install the environment, and then I want to give you a very quick walkthrough through the portion of the environment which we will use in the next couple of modules. I want to introduce the playground specifically. I want them to show you something about variables, printing to the console, and saving your playground projects. So the first part, which I will show you, is to download the Xcode from the App Store. It's a pretty simple procedure. So you just open your App Store on your Macintosh, you type Xcode in the upper right corner, and you will find the Xcode environment. And then after it's installed, you can just launch the environment and do the things which I will show you today here in the class to get familiar with the environment. Good. So to see it live here, to install Xcode, the first thing you do is you actually launch the App Store. You select Xcode here. If you have a very fast computer, then it will immediately show here the Xcode environment. You can install it from here. It's for free. I have it installed, so in my computer it would just say open, gives a description. So the current version is 7.2, and you can actually really expect that that updates fairly rapidly, like every couple of months it updates. So the next one is probably 7.2 something, and then you go to 7.3. So if I install the application, then the next thing is to open it. I can open it from here, or I can open it then from my bar down there. When I open my Xcode environment, what you see here is the Welcome to Xcode screen. It shows you always a version number which you use. One thing to point out, in this first part of the programming class, we actually mostly work with what's called the playground. But later we work with a full version of Xcode, where I also show you how to write an application with the IDE so that you can actually deploy it to with the user interface, so that you can deploy it then also to your iPhone. So when we start here with the playground, so the other sections which you see here in the upper right corner, there are all the previous programs. So you can actually go into previous projects and open those projects, or you can go here and say start with the playground. When you start the playground is an environment which allows you to check out or test out programming features. So it has most of the programming language pieces accessible. Even the Cocoa framework is accessible through the playground. The beginning, for us, it's very important here to get familiar with basic language concepts, and all those ones we actually can implement through the playground. When you select this environment, you can decide, do you want to develop for iOS, for the Mac, or do you want to develop for the TV? So I leave it here with iOS. You can give your playground a name. So I would call it right now, for example, UCI dash playground. So I call it UCI playground, and open next, and then it lets me actually save that environment. So I can create a folder or just create it here in that folder and store everything which I have here. Now, the playground is a very limited view of all the capabilities which you have in Xcode, right? So it's the first step here. There is a couple of things you might want to look at navigation-wise. So there's an area where you actually can type code. The first thing which it does here, it imports the UI kit. So that's one of the kits which is necessary to work with any user interface components. You see here a green line on top. So every line in green actually means that we have a comment. So anything which starts actually with the 2 slashes is code which is not being executed. On the right side, you see the results of what you type, right? So in this case here, for example, I have a var. A variable is actually basically a construct where you store data in memory. In this case, it's usually untyped or typed. In this case, we have actually a string variable. Actually, it's not a string variable. We infer the type of this data. Now, we assign here a string. Strings are indicated by these marks, quotation marks. So if I change this here to hello UCI, right? So then what happens in the playground is anytime when you make a change, the playground will immediately execute the code, right? And so in this case here, it will immediately execute the assignment of the string, hello string, to the variable which I called str. So that's just the name, right? I could call this Peter if I wanted to, right? So this is just the name of my variable. So there's certain things which you can't do. Like, for example, var indicates that this will be a variable. So the compiler actually runs through my code. If I would name it var, if I would name my variable var, then I get an error. Errors are indicated here with this little red exclamation mark. If I look at that, and it explains to me in detail what this error is about. And so I basically cannot use that keyword there. So I change that back to str, and my code is working fully again. I can show you some other items. So to control the user interface, you have the ability to bring in different panes. So this left pane here in this case is currently in the view for our file, our source code, right? So currently we have the UCI playground. It has certain source files and resources. We don't have anything in these folders. I can search if I wanted to look for certain files, or if I wanted to look for certain text constructs, I can do that here. Or if I have errors, then they will show up here, or any notifications from the compiler, from the system, will show up here. So usually in the beginning I would leave it here. As projects get much bigger, then you have a lot more capabilities actually to filter out, like what kind of files do you want to see. All that happens here in the lower left corner. You can also limit it to recent files which you work on. So overall, you could say the XCode environment is very, very feature-rich, and it's very, very, there are a lot of shortcuts which you can use, different alternatives to get to your views. You can fully customize your user interface. And right now we are just looking at a very small subset, which is actually the playground. On the upper right corner, you can actually then get into additional sections where you can get help and further information about your code, or you can actually show the console in the button. So if I wanted to change now some of my code, the next thing which I could do is I could say, for example, str equal str plus add UCI. And then I bring this back to hello Ralph. Or add UCI. So what happens here is I have here a string. The string has assigned value of hello students. Then I take my string and I say string is equal to that string plus another string at UCI. Or I can make that shorter, and I can just say string plus equal at UCI. So that's the notation there. Or I can actually take that string and print it to the console. So I can just say print string. So if I print my string and execute that code, then what happens is this string will actually be printed to the console. So right now, what we do here is we just really write small code inside our playground and get familiar with the language. From there, the next step is to write applications which you execute from the command line. And if it's command line applications, you might want to instruct them actually to print to the console, right? So you would use those print statements in there. Other features which are actually really rich here is I can say string2 is equal to something like str dot. And now you see there's a lot of type ahead functionality, right? So there's like basically a lot of functions to manipulate or to modify strings or to work with strings. One thing which I could lowercase string str dot. Oh. That. Is it too lower? Lowercase string gives me an error. Okay. str, so I need a string actually, right? So in this case, actually, I define a new string, string2 lowercase string, get a different error. I can also do this, str equal, I use that string. So what it did here, basically, it took the string which I had here in my string, and it just modified it to a lowercase string. So there's a big, huge library of string manipulation functions, and I can print these values in the user interface. Now, when I'm done with this, I can take my playground files and I can save them back into my file system. And we will, over time, actually provide you with a lot of samples, actually, in form of playground files, and let you work on those samples. A few things I would like to point out is, so we used XCode 7.2 with Swift 2.0. The tools develop very rapidly. So what you need to get used to is finding defects, actually, when you use sample code, or when you download code from somewhere. When you then basically load it into your latest version of XCode with the latest version of Swift, you very often see like some of those warnings and errors, the ones which I just saw when I just typed ahead with some of the functionality, right? So when that happens to you, you need to find a way to be very quickly self-sufficient. So when those samples don't compile, my suggestion is always read those error messages which you see and read them very thoroughly. Then take those error messages and copy them into a regular Google search, and then just find out like what kind of solutions are out there if you can't find the solution. Probability is actually very, very high that when you upgrade to a new version, and if that actually caused any errors, that many developers ran into the same problems. And so you very often will be pointed to a website called Stack Overflow. That's a website we trust actually very much. It's a very well monitored site. It's a site where people are actually getting rating for providing good comments, where people basically create their profiles and really strive to help the community. So these sites help a lot to provide you with solutions for those little problems. And my recommendation is follow that step, right? Take the error message you find, read it very thoroughly, don't get frustrated, type that error message into Google, look at the solution, follow the steps in the solution, try to apply them to your code, and you will see very quickly it will compile again. And in addition to taking this course, reading books, I believe really that that's the most efficient way to become a good programmer and to really learn with every single time when something goes wrong more about your development environment. So don't give up. So that's my message there. Summary, so we introduced XCode as the development environment. I showed you the sandbox. Right now we wrote the first sample code here in that environment, not the sandbox, but the playground actually. And so then we got familiar with variables. We will do a lot more about that in the next modules. And I showed you one way to print something to the console. We showed you some type ahead functionality. So those things we are familiar with right now.